Hey guys, how's it going? This is Derek Craig here with another oilfieldbasics.com Discover podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. We've got a pretty interesting topic lined up for you here today. We haven't touched much on water at all on this podcast, so definitely a time to start that. And we're not talking about water treatment or anything like that today. We're actually talking about water management within multiple states. So we're going to be talking with members from the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. So it's a group that was formed for the states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland to basically manage their water resources within those states. So the actual mission of the commission is to enhance public welfare through comprehensive planning, water supply allocation, and management of water resources of the Susquehanna River Basin. And so like I said, New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. So they're definitely going to add in some good context in terms of how that's done and how that's regulated and just some trends that they're seeing. So definitely would be pretty insightful. And this obviously they've got ties with the Appalachian Basin, so the Marcellus especially, shale gas plays, maybe a little bit of Utica, probably mostly Marcellus, but they're familiar with oil and gas and other industries. And so it'll be very interesting discussions. I'm excited to dive into that, but just wanted to welcome any new listeners that we have to the show. Definitely check out our full library of episodes that we have. We've covered a whole range of topics, so definitely check it out. And also, again, to our faithful listeners, welcome back for another episode. We always encourage you guys to always leave a review on the podcast. That helps others to find us and helps the knowledge to be spread. So I really appreciate you guys for listening. And joining me today, I've got Drew Dehoff. He's the executive director of the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. And just from here on out, I'm just going to say SRBC for simplicity. And then also got Jason Oyler here. He is the general counsel and secretary. So great to have you guys with me today.
Great to be here.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
I'm still getting used to Zoom, and I think this is the first three-person podcast I've done in a while. So definitely pretty excited to have the conversations here today. And we definitely got a lot to talk about. But where are you guys joining us from? Are you guys all Pennsylvania residents or what?
Yes.
Yeah, for the most part. We have a few. We're in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the capital. We have a couple staff in a satellite office on the Pennsylvania-New York border.
Oh, okay.
But
Awesome.
Yeah, most of us are here in central Pennsylvania.
Well, I'm glad to have you guys here today. I'm recording here in Colorado, and we're just starting to get hit with a little bit of a storm. So hopefully it doesn't come over the mic here, but my apologies if you suddenly hear hail hitting the window. That might be my heart dropping to my feet. But
yeah, if I get hail, you're going to see me quickly run away.
Right.
I'm experienced.
Yeah. So and just for some context too, so we are filming this over Zoom, so there will be a YouTube version of this available also. So if you guys want to see, put some faces to the names, you can definitely catch us on our YouTube channel as well. So, but without further ado, guys, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your backgrounds and also specifically the SRBC and what it is that you guys do and try to regulate and what you're trying to promote. And so I guess we'll start with Drew.
Okay. As far as background, I've actually been with the commission starting in the 90s as an intern in grad school and held different positions and was appointed executive director about seven years ago.
Awesome.
The commission was formed in 1971 by the three states and the federal government, with the interest being comprehensive management of the resource, recognizing that it starts in New York, dips down into Pennsylvania for a little bit, flows back north into New York, and then through Pennsylvania and into Maryland and Chesapeake Bay. So the sort of primary concerns at the time, they actually started thinking about forming the commission in the 60s, and things that were grabbing headlines then aren't too much different than what's grabbing headlines now.
Yeah.
Nuclear power plants were being designed and built, and they were designed to consume a lot of their cooling water as opposed to the older coal plants that would just, once through cooling, pull a lot of water out, but put most of it back. So there was some concern about the potential for growth in energy usage. There was a lot of focus on the Chesapeake Bay and the impacts of the Susquehanna on the bay. And in the 60s, a couple large pipelines were being built. The city of Baltimore lies outside the basin, but built a pipeline to the lower river for a supplemental water supply. And the city of Chester, which is just outside of Philadelphia, formed an authority and did the same thing. They built a large pipeline to the lower river. So there was concern about these diversions of water and what that potential impact might be on the residents and the ability of the basin to manage itself. So the 3 states and the federal government formed a compact to oversee the resources of the basin on a joint basis. So offered pretty broad authorities to the commission in terms of water supply management, water allocation, resource protection, conservation, but largely it came down to flow management and filling in gaps and fostering coordination and cooperation among the states so that they didn't end up suing each other like some of our neighboring states had done in the past.
Yeah, no, definitely a pretty interesting, definitely a very valid reason to form a commission and stuff like that. I mean, so I'm from the Ohio River, I assume basin, but area, Ohio River Valley, and so forms a barrier between a handful of different states. So definitely have to have some form of, I can see how that would definitely be useful to have kind of an oversight commission to help regulate all this. And of course, and again, I'm not sure where all the viewers are here listening to this or watching this on YouTube, but definitely within, especially the rivers in Appalachia, right? They're so heavily industrialized. You got all kinds of different plants withdrawing from them and even putting back in. And so, yeah, definitely a very interesting dynamic. But so, Jason, tell us what goes on with the general counsel, man.
Sure. No, I've been practicing attorney for 20 years. And so I've done a variety of things, including stints with our state resource agencies. I've practiced environmental law or administrative law for my entire career. And I joined a commission 6 years ago. Drew hired me, so I'm grateful. But it's interesting. It's a different kind of government agency. It is formed by a contract, essentially, between the states. It's approved by the Congress as provided for in the Constitution. Now you have compacts out west there in Colorado that are much older than ours. That deal with the flow of the river. But a lot of the Western compacts are much older. They generally sort of set a target of, say this much is going to be, or an allocation to each state generally, and then leave it for them to figure out. The commission, we're modeled after the Delaware River Basin Commission, which is right next door to us from New Jersey and New York. And they created a standalone agency to go with this commission, in part to more actively manage. And they gave us broader powers to regulate and manage. Now, as Drew said, we've tended to focus on areas that are gaps between our member jurisdictions. So we don't focus a lot on water quality. Our compact is designed that we defer mostly to the states on water quality. But on water quantity, that's really the area where we've developed a lot of our regulatory program, starting shortly after the compact was formed in the 70s, the regulation of consumptive use of water, which means water that is used and not returned to the basin. That's relevant for oil and gas because we consider all downhole use of water. Mm-hmm. It essentially becomes consumptively used because even when it comes back, it's not, able to be returned, and it's actually lately largely recycled and put back downhole. Mm-hmm. So, but our consumptive use regulations have been in place since the mid 70s. And then our groundwater withdrawal regulations came into play in 1978 and surface water withdrawals in 1995. So basically, if you withdraw water within the 3-state area that comprises the Susquehanna River Basin, at a sufficient quantity, you come to us. But with unconventional natural gas drilling, it was unknown to this area prior to about 2008, and that's probably where I think a lot of our story starts. For folks that are listening to your podcast.
Gotcha. Yeah, and how many? I guess in previous conversations before we hit the record button here, you're mentioning that these commissions aren't all that common across the U.S. Can you kind of hit on that, or what trends you've seen there, what other states do to I mean, if it's just something within just one state, I'm sure they could just handle it. But if it crosses multiple state lines, how people handle that?
Yeah, there are a variety of compaction agreements. Like Jason said, in the West, some of them are very focused on allocating water. Some are more planning than they don't necessarily have a lot of authority, but they try to conduct long-term planning. There are some that are related to water quality. There are some that are related to invasive species and protecting endangered species. So yeah, it's really just an interest in recognizing that rivers often form boundaries between states. So you have states that are actually two sides of the river and may have different designs on or plans on how to use it. Or the Susquehanna, there's no equivalent to a border, like border river like the Delaware or the Potomac. So I usually characterize it as an upstream downstream river. So they don't face each other across the river from bank to bank. But what happens in the one upstream is very important to the downstream rivers, or downstream states. So really a compelling reason for states to enter into agreements, considering how important water is in everything: agriculture, industry, drinking water. It's really development. It's just centered around water.
So yeah, compacts are relatively common for Western rivers, and they usually come forth because of litigation over the past 100 years. I mean, even the case that started it all was a fight between Colorado and some of its downstream neighbors, where in 1902, the state of Colorado took the position that God gave them the headwaters to use all the waters they saw fit, and whether that meant that there was not a drop left for downstream states, so be it. The U.S. Supreme Court saw differently, and the idea of equitable apportionment arose, where the court will say, you get this, you get this, you get this. The court doesn't like to do it, and states don't like to be told what it is. So then they formed compacts or agreements saying, rather than let the courts tell us what we're going to be able to have, we'll agree among ourselves what it is and form a compact. And like I said, a lot of those compacts out west are older. They're from the 20s, the 30s or 40s. Like I said, we're a little bit newer. There was one proposed for down in Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, the Apalachicola Flint River system, that never came to fruition, and they're litigating. They're in and out before the U.S. Supreme Court because it's a battle between states, where Florida essentially said, Georgia, you're using too much water, and you basically dewatered the Apalachicola Bay and killed our oyster fishery. So that's the kind of things where the compacts are trying to avoid, and that's the spirit in which like a lot of the compacts like ours are entered. If there's not a compact, or there's not a lot of, as Drew said, it's more planning, it still relies basically on your state authorities for basically the amount of water used and how to regulate. So it's still largely up to the states. But the idea behind compacts, as Drew mentioned, is that rivers don't know state political boundaries. Mm-hmm. And the idea behind watershed management compacts like ours sort of reflect that. They said the rules should be the same, and they should be even, whether you're in New York or Pennsylvania or Maryland, with regard to the use of the Susquehanna River. And that's where we start from.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's definitely a pretty interesting background and a little history lesson there. That's really cool. Just to have that understanding then. So it sounds like just pretty much kind of like friendly self-regulation among states.
We hope.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess one of the things I'd like to I think start off with is just talking about industry kind of overall, not so much specific to oil and gas yet. We're definitely going to get there, and I think this will be the good segue into it. But just overall, how different industries are regulated, what typical needs you see from an industrial kind of standpoint.
Yeah, I mentioned that I've been with the commission starting as an intern, so I've held different positions. I don't think I mentioned that my background is engineering, water resource engineering. So I was involved in some of the work we did with managing water use and some permitting work. So I saw variety of industries, and you name it, it uses water. I've been in a rubber factory, a glass factory, golf courses, and candy manufacturing facilities. A lot of the water, processed water, cooling water is a common use. Again, what drives largely in the basin is related to power and energy. Coal power plants early on, nuclear power plants now. We have some hydroelectric dams that manipulate the flow of the river. And then we have some sort of legacy issues related to coal mining, to timbering, in the 1800s and early 1900s that have left serious issues that we're still dealing with, like acid mine drainage and just all the sediment topsoil that washed down when the hills, the hill slopes were denuded of trees. So really, it's across the board, and we do differentiate industrial water use. Any water use really is in terms of whether it's consumptive or not. Jason made that reference that consumptive use is very important. But we look at that. What is the water that's lost to the basin that is not put back and returned, that someone else downstream can use it, and that's important. It needs to be managed, and that's a unique authority we have among our states. But it's also necessary to look at the withdrawals themselves, because they can have a very localized impact. You have to ensure that the withdrawal of water, whether it's from a groundwater well or a river or stream, that the size, the quantity of it is sustainable for that particular source, and again is not causing some local impact that impairs someone else's ability to rely on the resource as well.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I would add to that is the normal, I'll say before 2008, the normal predict if it needed a lot of water, it would be sited and built along a larger, rather the main rain stem of the river itself or one of the main branches or some of the larger tributaries. You could almost map it out where it would be. Mm-hmm. With natural gas, that changed. You have now an industrial use that has to be located where the natural resource that they're extracting is. So it's not like you're building a factory and placing it next to the Susquehanna River, knowing that you'll have plenty of water for your industrial needs. So that was the first challenge with the gas industry, but what sets it apart from some of the other industrial uses that we've been used to.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and I guess that's something that have you seen a trend kind of to centralize those systems too among oil and gas operators trying to centralize their water system or put like a little pipeline in place so that they can withdraw larger volumes from the larger tributaries or main water streams?
Yes, I mean, we have seen, and at our encouragement, we want them to take water from the larger waterways because they have the better ability to buffer and provide larger quantities than smaller headwater streams. But the development wasn't always that way. In the very beginning, the natural gas industry just basically located water streams near them, which in some of the conversations I've had with the folks, I mean, they were coming from Texas and Oklahoma to turn around and be like, oh, well, there's a stream right there. We can just obviously pull from it. It's never that convenient in the drier, more arid parts of the country.
Right. It's like Christmas to them.
Right. Yeah, right. But yeah, those headwater streams are far more sensitive to the level of withdrawals that you need for hydraulic fracturing. So that was the initial concern, and the commission had to operate very quickly to come up with a revised set of rules for how to manage this, because it was so unlike any other large industrial use that we'd ever faced.
And that's just because it was sporadic. It was kind of all over the place.
It was spread out, and it was in areas, frankly, that weren't in Pennsylvania, in New York, that weren't used to any sort of industrial development. They're the Pennsylvania wilds. They were more for their biggest industries were recreational tourism for their hunting and fishing and hiking and camping. And, it's not as big of an industrial profile. A lot of the industrial uses in the basin are located where a lot of the population in the basin is, which is in the lower Susquehanna, down toward the Maryland border and up through Harrisburg.
Okay, gotcha. One of the questions I have, in terms of just to give people an idea of scale, and I'm sure this is going to differ for different operations, different by companies, differ by almost everything. But just kind of give us an idea of what kind of scale are we talking typically? So when you do these withdrawal permits or whatever it is that goes through your agency, just give us a little bit of a scale, put it in perspective for us, please.
There's our traditional regulatory thresholds are for 100,000 gallons a day withdrawal over a 30-day average, and for consumptive use, 20,000 gallons a day. But we recognized early on that the nature of the industry was going to be a challenge, like Jason said, pulling from multiple sources, taking to one location, or pulling from one location and taking to multiple sources. That we early on imposed a gallon one rule. Really, any source of water had to be reviewed and approved. And again, like Jason said, that was because some of the sources were some of the smaller, more pristine headwater streams that were very sensitive and could be sizable withdrawals. So we, I think we probably had a few under 100,000 gallons a day, and some of the larger ones were up to 3 million gallons a day.
Oh, wow.
Largely driven by the infrastructure. We had a lot. We had early on some companies propose and build sites for 3 million gallons a day that were trucking, and they found out as it evolved that logistics were just not there.
Thankfully, that was a quick recognition.
The former reviewer reviewing their ability to move 3 million gallons a day by truck said something like, the trucks would have to come in and perform like nimble ballerinas and able, to move in timing just perfect, to fill up and get in and get out, and there's a new one ready to go. And, that evolved over time, and sites consolidated, but and we encourage the quantity of the withdrawal to be commensurate with the source, what's available, and we impose restrictions to help encourage that.
Yeah, one of the hallmarks of what we did is for consumptive use, we're interested to know where the water's coming from, how much they're using, and also they provide us with a post hydrofracking report that tells us how much they used for fracturing events. So we've been able to collect a lot of high quality, reliable data, and frankly, a lot of folks, we get a lot of requests for our data from government agencies like EPA, to the industry itself, to a lot of academics and universities. And the data set that we've built in the Susquehanna, like when the EPA put out its hydrofracturing report, and it's now been more than a few years ago, it almost relied exclusively on our data because it was it was some of the best available and most comprehensive available. But what it also told us is that, so we learned certain things. So you could trace the history of the gas industry in Pennsylvania for unconventional from about 2008 on. Early on, maybe in 2010, we found the average water used per fracturing event was about 4 million gallons per fracturing event. In 2018, which is the latest that we've compiled and analyzed numbers for, we're up to 12 million gallons per fracturing event. Now, the reason for that is various, but largely it's they're using longer laterals. The technology has gotten to the point, and also I think the economics got to the point where when the natural gas prices have been low, and they've been working on building pipelines to get gas more to market. So the activity, the new activity in Pennsylvania, sort of decreased. But what they found, they were concentrating more economically on using the pads that they had already created, but lengthening the lateral footprint, and which uses more water. So we've seen from the beginning to now almost a 600% increase in the amount of water to use per fracturing event. But we track it. We know what it is. We know what the trends are, and we try to anticipate what future water management needs are because of that.
Now, whenever you say per water fracturing event, though, is that basically like basically per well?
Right.
Okay, gotcha. So sounds like a large increase, but at the same time, like what you're talking about, we'd have fewer wells though altogether. So overall, quantity for oil and gas industry, have you seen it? I'm sure it hasn't been the 600% increase. I'm sure it hasn't followed that exact number, right? But has there been, I guess, overall trend in terms of withdrawal with oil and gas? What have you seen there?
Trend was, the trend, our highest usage was in 2012, 2013.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you saw dropping off rather sharply. But then basically 2018, our second highest quarter of water usage, we track it by quarter,
Mm-hmm.
was in 2018.
Oh, okay.
So even though the wells decreased, the amount used per well and the general activity of the industry toward, in 2018 saw it largely rebounding as far as water use.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's not the same level of new wells or new pads or things like that. And the other thing we've seen is an increase in the number of wells drilled per pad.
Mm.
In the beginning, we might have had 1, 2, or 3 on there. Sometimes they just drilled to hold the lease
Mm-hmm.
or what they had to. Now we have pads with as many as 10, 11, or 12
Right. More of a development kind of mode.
wells. Right now they're building those out. But yeah, the concentration is more on the existing wells than building new ones.
Okay, gotcha. Drew, looked like you had something to add.
I will just add that, we, in terms of, again, this the interesting nature of the industry, I think our average is 10, 11, 12 million gallons a day, but you have days that includes a lot of zeros,
Right.
when there is no background. So, and it's hard to, it's hard to manage a resource that way. When early on, 2008 timeframe, we did a projection based on, and we were flying blind, but looking at number of rigs and water use per fracture going on in the Barnett, in Oklahoma and Texas. And we projected it may eventually hit 30 million gallons a day. But like Jason said, it pretty quickly ramped up to 10, and it was around 10 million gallons a day. And then we didn't know what would happen, but it sort of fluctuated. And
Right. It's going to differ basin by basin.
yeah, right. But which I sometimes like to put in perspective, golf courses in the basin use more on a daily basis. But it's really just managing the when it happens, it's intense, and there's a lot of water, in a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and that is exactly my next question was going to be, how does this compare to other industries, right? Because everybody loves to talk about how much water we use as an industry, and it's definitely no small footprint. But put that into context to with us too, and just lay it out there for us.
I think I said earlier on the driver is power, withdrawals and the consumptive use by the power plants. It's 95% of the water usage.
Oh wow!
And then we have agriculture, industrial usage, and then like golf courses and gas comes in around fourth place or something like that.
Okay.
10.
It depends on the year. We track the usages. Power generation is always number 1, agriculture number 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then typically natural gas development, because we separate it out from other industrial uses, comes in at number 3, but sometimes it's number 4. And the one that does edge it out, as Drew said, is recreational uses, golf courses, ski resorts, and the ever-present water park. They use a lot of water, a lot of evaporation, a lot of, so, when we add all them together throughout the basin, it's in there every day in the hotter months. So, it's a different kind of usage, but it is, as far as quantity of water used, that's about where they fall.
Mm-hmm. Now, is that do we kind of fall in the same place there in terms of the consumptive numbers?
Yeah, those are the consumptive numbers.
Oh, those are
that
consumptive.
we're referring to. Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure if like the power plants and stuff, if they actually just recycled it and put it back in the river when it was cooled or what.
Yeah, there is some, but it's like up until just a few months ago, we had 3 nuclear power facilities in the basin. 3 Mile Island has closed and are decommissioning, but one nuclear power plant still evaporates a tremendous amount of water on a daily basis.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was stupid. They evaporate that water.
They return some too, because they're cooling as it gets better once through, but they still evaporate a ton of water even if they're returning it. So withdrawal wise, the power industry is also number 1, but they do have more return. The gas industry does not have return. And that's one difference that you would draw between those 2 industries.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, any other like big differences that you guys can see about our industry overall that we haven't hit on yet?
Well, I think something we try to highlight is that because of the decentralized nature and the sort of sporadic use, we ended up with multiple withdrawal sites scattered around that many may sit idle, for a long period of time, which is fine, but it does complicate planning and how to manage that resource because we ended up with multiple companies having sites on the same stretch of a stream, and even though they may not have been using them simultaneously,
sometimes on either side of the stream, like within.
Guys, please share. but we have to assume that they're using them simultaneously, even though that probably doesn't happen. But for planning purposes, for resource management, that's been a real challenge, and it actually ends up sort of shooting us all in the foot because that takes certain gallonage off the table, out of the availability for the next guy. Whereas if we were more consolidated, like exactly what a industrial facility or nuclear power plant is using every day, they take it out and put some back.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point, or definitely more intermittent.
They assume the worst for the gas withdrawals, and which ends up looking like on paper there's more of an potential impact on the local stream because they're not using simultaneously, but we have to treat it that way.
Gotcha. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I mean, because I'm sure it's hard to guess, anyways. What days the first day of we're going to be using water for frack, and then when we're actually going to be done, and all the downtime, and
And what that leads to, which is something different that the industry has had to learn to deal with, is restrictions and pass-bys. The nuclear power plant, they operate. They're allowed to operate. They built on the larger rivers. We've managed that resource, but when we have large withdrawals for the gas industry in smaller streams, or when we have multiple withdrawals on one stream, we have to put some restrictions in place. So they have to learn how to manage that interruptibility, which is unusual for an industry. So they develop storage, they develop multiple sourcing, sharing agreements. So it's, like Jason said, we had to really adapt and put some new things into place to be able to accommodate that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I'll just build a little bit on it because Drew touched on it. The difference is the uncertainty in their operations, and when we talk to our the companies that deal with us and say, hey, well, what I'm trying to plan out, what do you think things look like? It changes quickly for them. I mean, as you're aware, I mean, you think you're doing one plan, and then 3 months later you scrapped it and gone to a different. So even the areas that they work, the cluster of wells they want to work, they think a pipeline is going to be in, but it's delayed, so they have to shift to something else. That you just don't have those kind of, changes in the nature of your usage. A lot of the industrial usage, they can respond up and down to fluctuations in the market, how much of a product they're selling or not. Is a company selling more bottled iced tea and they need to up it, or is it seasonal? We usually get a good feel even for seasonal fluctuations for most other industries. Just hasn't been able to be done with the gas industry.
Yeah, and we like to keep everybody on our toes, including ourselves. to put it lightly. Yeah, no, definitely makes sense there. Do you see people or operators, oil and gas companies, come to you and just trying to basically block off, say, okay, we can withdraw up to this limit, and then for like the longer term, so say they're putting in place like a water delivery system, and they want to be able to withdraw from like the main river, I don't know, a couple million gallons a day or something like that for their entire field. They may or may not be running fracks all the time, maybe one or two frac. But they try to have like a blanket kind of permit. Do you see that happen a lot?
It's a good question. I think they definitely. There's no such thing as a blanket permit. We work with them to, whether it's multiple sources, whether it's sharing agreements, which is something that was not in place 10 years ago. That once the water is withdrawn, we figure it's one company to another, one pad to another. We don't care. Just track it.
Gotcha. I guess maybe a better way of phrasing the question was kind of what's the typical length that you would see for like a withdrawal permit? Are these pretty much like pretty long term, like okay, a couple of years, or is this for a month or?
For surface water, it's 5 years.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Right.
And so like, if it is kind of a more of a localized withdrawal and they might develop one portion of the field and move to another portion. Do they, it's not going to take 5 years. Once it's, do they basically just kind of tell you when they're done and you just remove that, or so you can allocate more, or what?
Sure.
Yeah, what we tend to see, and Drew can correct me, is that they have their area. Different operators sort of have their areas where they have their wells, because of the cost of transporting water. They are mindful. They want to obviously get as close as they can. So they'll have multiple withdrawal permits with us, usually in different areas that can supply their wells. And then, like as Drew said, so if they're on smaller streams, especially, they're more likely to have what we call pass-by flows, which is when the stream, they're tied to a USGS stream gauge. When the stream hits a certain level, they have to stop withdrawing.
Oh, okay.
And maybe let that water pass by. And they typically hit in what you would expect to be the warmer months, the Jason months, as they like to say, July through November. But
I had a nickel for every time.
If I did, I'd be a very, very wealthy man. So sometimes you see them too figure out what sources they have that are interruptible. Some of them make up the difference by buying from some local municipal public water supplies that have the ability to provide bulk sales. So they generally have their water management strategy that usually involves multiple withdrawals. But like I said, we try to encourage them to go to the river and the bigger tributaries, because that has more water available more of the time. And that works for them. But as Drew said, they built storage. A lot of them are going to build pipelines and pipelining to storage facilities. And that's a lot of times preferable for local impacts, because the biggest complaint we get, which we don't regulate when a new withdrawal comes in, is, there's going to be a whole bunch of truck traffic. That's still a locally regulated concern in the basin. We don't regulate how many trucks come in or whether the roads are rated. There's other agencies for that. But that's usually the biggest complaint we hear from folks when they hear about a withdrawal location going in near them, is how many trucks is it going to be? And then the industry's been responsive to that, I think, in a lot of ways, by saying, it's pipelines. We're piping it to a larger storage facility, and we've built a storage pond that we can pull from any time. And what we want to encourage is them to sip the water when the flows are high, especially during the spring flows, put it into storage, and then it's there for the summer months when there's less water available in the streams, and what water is available is needed for other downstream users and for ecological purposes for the fish and other aquatic life.
Gotcha. Yeah, and then so another thing I want to ask you guys about is to talk about, first off, clear up the question for me about quality monitoring. It sounds like you guys do it and report on it some, but at the same time, I think in your kind of opening statements, you said it's not really what you focus on, or you don't do a lot of it. Correct me on that if you would.
We the compact does speak to water quality, but we do not regulate it. We don't put standards in place. We don't enforce them.
Oh, okay.
Just the states handle that. But we have a very big and important supporting role in water quality, and have going back to the 70s and 80s. Chesapeake Bay focused early on, still is, in terms of what are the trends, nutrients and sediments that are impacting the bay. Looking at water quality changes, interstate streams, flowing from one state to another. So it was very natural for us to have an interest 10 years ago to start monitoring for potential impacts of unconventional gas industry as well. So with the support of the industry, we established about 60 sites that were doing really state-of-the-art stuff, real-time, continuous monitoring, where they would take take a sample every 5 to 15 minutes and relay that via satellite or cell signal, so that it was real-time on our website, so that we could see it and then public could view it. Now it's not, it's some basic parameters like pH, dissolved oxygen, temperature, specific conductivity, but they can be useful in detecting long-term changes, or even if the placement is right, spills or some other sort of, event that may happen. We've been real interested in that. Established sites, monitoring sites in areas that have fracking and areas that don't have fracking for comparative purposes, but then also areas where we were monitoring before fracking happened and continue to monitor after it began in that watershed. So you really need at least 3 years, but 5 or 10 years of data is really what you want when you look at trends, just because of every year is different hydrologically and activity based, and there's other things going on in the watershed. But now that we have a good number of years of data under our belts, we've been assessing the data and looking at trends, and haven't really seen impacts that we can definitively tie to the activity of the industry. Yes, there are changes, but like I said, there's other things going on in those watersheds as well. But we think it's been an important. No one knew what we were getting into. I think it was a really important function to take that on, and again, appreciated that the industry was supportive of it. We continue to do that and plan to continue that for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I know for sure. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would add to that too. In addition to the real-time parameters, we also send crews out seasonally, I think 4 times a year at each station, to grab a sample where they run a broader suite of water quality parameters, including metals, radio, nuclear, tracers, and everything you might. So we're looking for things that you might expect. If we start to see impacts. One of the things that I tell people is that, one of the concerns that we heard from the public side when the gas industry came in was, like any other environmental permit, you guys you look at each individual site. What about cumulatively? And our water quality network is in part designed to look for a system-wide or basis comparison to see if we're seeing systemic effects that might escape individual permit reviews. And like I said, so far, as Drew said, the data hasn't borne out anything that because we have, any trends that we've seen so far, we've also seen in some watersheds that don't have any gas industry. Really, the only trend I think is increased turbidity, and we sort of have done the homework and realized that it's really more tied to road construction. Whether it's for a natural gas road, forestry, or some other type of road, that has an incredible impact on water quality. And that's something that we discovered through having this network.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, and the question, I guess, and I'm glad you guys took it down this road too, because I was definitely going to ask you about it. But just the idea of water quality, water contamination, like the concern, just such a it's hard to navigate through, because if people have concerns, it's like they can be talking about it with all different angles or ideas in mind. So whether a lot of times, whenever you hear someone with water concerns, they're focused more on like the water wells or something, like downhole kind of contamination. But at the same time, then I guess the largest potential for anything is pretty much, I assume, and what you kind of alluded to is the surface spills running into streams and stuff. I guess would that be the biggest concern that you would think could play into water quality?
I think because they are rare. I think it's really just the more of the general infrastructure, the pad development, losing trees, stream crossings related to pipelines, things like that. It's really the sort of the land disturbance, I think, that poses the most. And because a lot of it is in headwaters that are sensitive and that are so clean to begin with, really it doesn't take much to introduce some impact to those areas.
Okay, gotcha. So
I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but in Pennsylvania, there's still a lot of, if the concerns you hear are that sort of gas migration concern. The State Department of Environmental Protection is in charge of those investigating those complaints and remediating where they find issues. That they still get those. Spills, not as much, but as Drew said, just having activity in a watershed that might otherwise be fairly well untouched is probably the next sort of biggest complaint that we hear from folks or concern about the impact of the industry.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and so it sounds like it's mostly just the surface disturbance and stuff. Does that compare then to any other industries coming in, and if they're building a plant, or if you have a big housing development kind of going in, is that pretty similar in terms of concerns of the change of the quality there?
I think it's a lot of the same impacts at work, a lot of the same mechanisms at work, right? But that's sort of, a power plant is short term, one and done, right. And then, but then you have stormwater to manage off the lot. So yeah, there's a lot of similarities.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point, and it's cool you guys are set up to be able to compare it, with states with no development and states or areas with development. One thing I just want to kind of quickly ask you too, because you mentioned the methane migration. Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand with the geology within especially certain areas of Pennsylvania, is just a natural kind of biogenic kind of gas migration from shallower reservoirs, untouched by us. I mean, that's not the ones we're going after, but correct me if I'm wrong, but that's been around for a while, right? And do you see that do you see methane in your main byway water monitoring stations, or what?
No, you're right. There's natural methane present in areas, and has been for years and years and years, millennia probably. We have undertaken some efforts to track that. We did some studies trying to determine whether methane present was. Thermogenic's one of them, right?
Yeah,
whether it's
or biogenic,
natural or whether it's migrating from a
Trust me,
well.
our scientific experts were conducting this, not us. But
I used to be a scientist. It's there, and we have done some studies. Something we're interested in. We weren't able to really conclude much about the limited look that we did, but we did see different signatures. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think it comes down to geology. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that our folks partnered with the U.S. Geological Service, maybe even out of Colorado on that one.
Oh, really?
if I remember correctly, because it's of concern in anywhere where you're drilling and extracting natural gas. They were trying to see if there were telltale markers that they could find in the methane to determine if it was from where it was coming from, and whether it was related to the unconventional drilling or more natural near surface sources. And so the science is still evolving on that, and hopefully we'll be able to get to a point to develop where you can sort of take those samples and have a really clear idea of where the gas is coming from. That's a big problem in gas migration cases that I'm aware of, is that having direct knowledge of where that's really coming from is a difficult analytical exercise and scientific exercise.
Yeah, I mean, because every formation is going to be a little bit different, but at the same time, and I guess just kind of fill in viewers and stuff too. So like biogenic, like the shallower gas that's more so generated from more recent deposition and stuff. And of course, once you got hydrocarbon, it's going to want to come to the surface because it's less dense. So it's going to find its way unless there's something stopping it. And just Appalachia in general is just a perfect case for just an area that's very, very rich with resources, and so that's, I think, one of the reasons why we see that. But then the thermogenic gas would be the deeper kind of reservoirs that we go after that have been kind of like thermally generated through thermal and heat processes and pressure and stuff that generate the hydrocarbons that we go after. So they typically look a little bit different. Their composition is going to be a little bit different. I think that's what you were talking to, that you're trying to pick up on the signatures of and see if you can kind of match that. But it's definitely not quite as open and shut or easy as that, but it's a high level overview. So one of the things, unless you guys have anything else to add before we dive into this, but one of the things I want to begin kind of concluding with is just your overall impressions of the industry, things that we can do better we've talked throughout this, kind of comparing us to other industries and whatnot, but just kind of from your own perspectives, how you think how or what we could do better as an industry. I know it's going to be kind of localized to, to the Susquehanna River Basin stuff, but I'm sure there's other applications, for people listening across the United States also.
Well, I'll start, and I know Jason has an idea on this, but we alluded to the unpredictability and frequent changing of priorities. When we're working here, no, we've changed our mind, we're going to work there. That's we recognize that that's a challenge with the industry, and but it makes it harder for us to prepare and harder for us to plan and react to the needs. But I think we've been pretty nimble and able to adjust and put some things in place over the years evolved that help accommodate that type of thing. And availability and proper locating of your sources is key to helping with the resource, but also in helping to ensure that they have the water they need. And Jason, do you want to chime in with?
Sure. I mean, the other thing that I see where they could do better, and I think they are doing better in our basin, is sharing water. Entering, so we don't have to have 3 different gas companies put their own withdrawal on, within 100 yards of each other on a stream.
Yeah.
It's not, put in one intake and then share the resources, especially given that your usage it's not constant every day.
Right.
And I think they've been doing better with that. I mean, I think that overall helps the resource. It helps us manage it better.
Mm-hmm. It helps provide steady source that aren't interrupted. We have, if we have to manage for 3 or 5 sources, we have to be careful about the restrictions. But if it's one source, it's easier to manage. Sorry to interrupt.
Gotcha.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that. And I think, I think in general, the industry has been getting better about, they were some of the first in our basin to really go heavier into technology like SCADA systems. Where they could even program in, if they have a pass by, they can actually program in the readings so that it shuts off. It's not, it's automatic.
Yeah.
Which is great. That helps their compliance. You reduce human error. As long as you remember to reprogram it every time your permit changes if you have slightly different pass by levels. So that's the one snafu. But I mean, generally, they've been good about using technology in a way to, enhance their ability to comply by, like I said, these automatic shutoffs and other things. And so I think that's where they could do better is keep focusing on that, leveraging technology, because really at the end of the day, we want, an industry that's complying with the rules and being responsive to those on a systemic level. And I think the industry, does try to do that, but you have a lot of different players. So being more uniform in that would be one area where I think they could do better.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your guys' comments there. And I think that the closing question here I'll leave you guys with, and you guys can add any additional comments afterwards as we wrap up. But, what do you guys see long-term for, the SRBC controlled area for long-term trends or future development? Just kind of give us a quick glimpse into there, what you guys are expecting to come down the line.
Gosh, if we knew that. Yeah, every so often we predict, what's what the next thing is. Every now and then, entrepreneurs decide they're going to develop hydropower at all the dams, and that doesn't go anywhere. But I think something that's definitely coming our way is, and we've already seen pipelines and more natural gas-fired power plants, and the decline of coal and nuclear plants, and that changes the makeup and the nature of the water use in the basin. So I think we're also, we're undertaking a comprehensive planning effort. We're required by the compact to have a comprehensive plan in place and keep it updated. So we're taking an update for the first time in 15 years. And, we're contemplating things just like that. What do we need to do? As development has continued in the basin, it may be that there are certain areas that are sort of hotspots where you have a nexus of water shortages and demand, increasing demand, and we may have to figure out something to do there, because generally we've been fortunate, water rich, particularly compared to a lot of areas of the country.
Yeah.
But that may not always be the case with climate change and with increasing development pressures, and so it's really hard to say. Chesapeake Bay is going to remain and again, that's not something we're directly involved with, but have a strong supporting role. But that's that and local water quality interests, I think, are really going to start to drive, what activity occurs and where.
Awesome. Well, I guess, and you mentioned that, the more and more kind of natural gas fired power plants coming in. Do you see a big difference in terms of how much water they're using? Is that for the good or, for worse?
Yeah,
this is a good success story. Jason, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, so the one thing we started noticing is, because power plants use a lot of water, is they come to us for permits, and we were seeing, about in 2012, 2013, we started to see an increase of the number of power plants coming in, and some of them weren't huge. They were proposing to use, wet cooling. The commission in 2014 passed a resolution, or early 2015. Correct me if I'm wrong, encouraging the use of dry cooling, which was unheard of on the East. It was really something you see in mostly more arid states where you don't have water and you have to do dry cooling. And it turns out there is a sweet spot of, even in our more humid Eastern climate, where they can effectively use dry cooling, not lose a lot of power generation off of it. And it reduces their water usage dramatically. When it goes from maybe 300 to 500 gallons per kilowatt hour to about 3 to 5.
Oh, wow.
So it's, and so we have a growing number of dry cooling natural gas fired power plants in the basin. And they're taking the place. In Pennsylvania, we've retired in the past, 8 years, we've retired maybe about a dozen coal-fired power plants. That generation has been taken up by maybe 24 or more smaller natural gas-fired power plants, which burns cleaner, lower carbon emissions, lower other pollutants, air pollution controls. So there's already been a shift in that sense that we've seen. That's been from water usage, it's positive in that those plants are using very, very little water, and sometimes can be built even below the thresholds that Drew mentioned. It also resolves a lot of issues they would have for discharge and getting an NPDES permit for the discharge. By going to dry cooling, it's a much more manageable prospect for them. And we find that they're locating, like when I said before, a lot of power before 2013, if you said there's a power plant, I'm going to say it's right next to a large body of water. Now I can't say that anymore, because with dry cooling and wanting to be nearer to the gas wells where they're getting supplied, they're not using water source as a driving factor for their siting, and that's something that's different and unusual.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate that perspective. I'm glad to hear that's a win for our industry and for the system as a whole. I assume, so I can post your guys' website and stuff in the show notes, and I can post your guys' LinkedIn or any types of contact info you want to throw at us. But if someone's interested in learning more about the SRBC or some of the studies that you guys have done or getting your numbers, where do you want to send them?
Definitely our website. We try to maintain a lot of information on there, or at least the information on how to get it, and that's srbc.net.
Okay, sounds good. And I will post that link in the show notes below, so if you guys are looking for that, you can find it there. Thanks again, guys, so much for being on today. I really appreciate what you guys do and for taking the time, especially in your evening, to share it with the rest of us.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you. See you, Derek.
All right, and thanks everybody for listening. Be sure to stay healthy, take care, and we'll catch you in the next episode, guys. Thank you.